So I noticed that a group of my favorite writers and filmmakers all have the following weird thing in common. They produced great works of art in the 1970s, skipped the 80s, and then returned in the 90s, or in one case, the year 2000. My questions for this video series: who are these people? What were their individual reasons for skipping the 1980s? And is there a larger cultural reason why a bunch of writers and filmmakers spontaneously did that? While every artist featured here fits the criteria of they did not release any work in their primary medium of activity in the 1980s, the extent to which they skipped the decade needs to be dissected on a case-by-case basis. It may be that something went terribly wrong in the 80s, and through these artists we can discern what happened by looking at what did not happen. In this series, we'll encounter transcendent works of art, the apex of popular entertainment, as well as bizarre misfires, sweet failure, and bitter success. Let's dive right in with our first artist who skipped the 80s and 90s. All right, let's start.
Mr. Anderson. Anderson. Mr. Anderson. No, Mr. Anderson. Oh, Mr. Anderson.
Roy Andersson is an acclaimed Swedish filmmaker. He has directed 6 feature films: Swedish Love Story, 1970, Gilead, 1975,
Skipping the 80s.
Songs from the Second Floor, 2000. So technically, as a feature film director, he skipped the 90s too.
In the 90s.
He then made 2 more films that comprise the Living trilogy: You the Living, in 2007, and A Pigeon Sat on a Branch Reflecting on Existence, from 2014. And then his most recent, About Endlessness, from 2019. This is an artist whose transformation during their break was the most extreme. He returns basically unrecognizable. We need to start with a quick look at the movie with which he made his triumphant return, Songs from the Second Floor, winner of the jury prize at Cannes and one of the most formally original movies ever made. It's one of those movies that is also an idea of what a movie could be as a storytelling form. It plays out in almost all static shots. There's exactly one camera move in the entire movie. It takes place on these immaculate sets, and it is a dark, slow satire. It feels like a modernist comic book or a rejected political cartoon, a haunted point-and-click adventure game. But above all else, it feels like a moving painting. All 4 movies he's made since his long break from feature filmmaking were created with a unique method to achieve this effect. Each shot is one scene. It begins life as a drawing. As they build the set from scratch, they also do blocking and camera rehearsals. About a month later, they have the final shot. These shots are all created in a studio space, but they use the trompe-l'oeil effect to create a sense of depth and a distance that isn't there.
Everything, if you really concentrate, you can see it's built.
Even if it's a mundane location that you figure, well, why not go shoot a real train station?
Han vill att det som är riktigt, sant, ska se ut falskt. Och det som är falskt ska se ut sant. Kanske det.
Because everything in these shots are artificially created, you can never achieve a full feeling of recognition. You cannot have been there. You can't have a memory of strolling through this train station because it doesn't exist. But it is rendered in a way that feels familiar. So you have familiarity without the security of recognition. While the storytelling style is often described as a series of vignettes, we do have a main character. As we'll discuss later, before and during his long absence from feature filmmaking, Andersson directed a lot of commercials, and he returned with a protagonist who is himself a salesman. There are 2 large events going on in the story, both of which are symptomatic of a non-functioning society. First, there is a mysterious, never-ending traffic jam. And second, the economy has simply failed for reasons that no one can explain. A character says enigmatically that they can't afford to work. The general feeling is that this is a world that has been sucked dry. All the traditional sources of authority or stability have been consumed into capitalism. Like our main man tries to bring his troubles to the priests, but the men of the cloth immediately turn the conversation to the economy and bemoan their inability to buy a second house. Our protagonist sees an acquaintance who committed suicide, a ghost, and eventually confesses that they were actually relieved when they heard the news because the protagonist owed him a great deal of money. A magic trick goes horribly wrong. A man is randomly beat up. The guy who appears to be in charge at the insane asylum is actually an inmate. The glorious general celebrating his 101st birthday is actually a Nazi. Nobody wants to buy Jesus Christ anymore, so into the landfill he goes. The economists, stumped, hire a psychic, and a young girl is sacrificed. All along, we're placed in the crowd to watch these things unfold. This is a vision of society empty of exactly the kind of love that animates his first film. Swedish Love Story is a melancholic romance, tender, beautiful, nostalgic, warm, but still aware of loneliness, particularly in the adult characters. In terms of visual and narrative style, it's almost impossible to tell that these two films are by the same director. How did we get from here to there, with one feature film and 20-odd years in between? The only whiff we get of Andersson's later style is in the ending of Swedish Love Story, when a bunch of drunk, middle-aged men in party hats try to go fishing in the fog. This, his first film, was a huge success. He felt imprisoned by the expectations this brought on.
Jag ska be att få presentera en osedvanligt framgångsrik ung svensk man som heter Roy Andersson. Det var han som gjorde filmen En kärlekshistoria. Den har ju setts kolossalt i Sverige bland annat.
Trött på kärlekshistoria. Jag var lite äcklad nästan över framgången.
Roy Andersson in the 70s is the living embodiment of the final two frames of a Life is Hell comic strip called The Los Angeles Ways of Death. He veered hard with his second film. Gilead from 1975 was a critical and financial failure. After this, he didn't release a theatrical film for 25 years. Despite how different these first three films are, there is a through line that unites them and that we can use to chart his evolution. It has to do with the act of looking. In Swedish Love Story, the romance is developed through the characters looking at each other, looking away, feeling the other look, seeing the other not look. The viewer is thrown into these glances and it feels warm and intimate. The two characters don't exchange a single word for the first 45 minutes of the movie. There's something cathartic about this scene deep into the film when they are finally looking each other straight in the face for an extended time. It reminds me of this shot in Ang Lee's Sense and Sensibility, when after many minutes of seeing everything from a colder remove, we suddenly fall into these close-ups, right as the character reveals his feelings. It's jarring in a beautiful way. In Gilead, the person looking is the main character. He's a witness to the somewhat strange culture of a hotel restaurant where he's just been hired. We're often seeing things from his point of view, but the film resists this as well. We have curious cinematic coverage like in this scene. By the way these people are looking at the camera, you'd expect the reverse shot to show the character receiving their gaze, but no, when we cut, the character isn't looking at all. This feels like foreshadowing to his later style, where he will remove the witness character from within the frame and assign that role to the audience. In his 1991 short film, World of Glory, the main character looks directly into the camera as he narrates to the audience, something that he repeats in his later films. The tableau and Gilead almost feel like scenes from his later films, but what would we have to do to get from this to that? Stretch out the time, like this part in Gilead when a parrot makes a horrible squawk and moves around the dance floor. Or here when the characters are scrounging around, grabbing handfuls of cash on a desolate beach. These are quick moments, but if we extended them for a few minutes and gradually let the image tell us a story, you could find those kinds of sequences in one of his later films. Emotionally, Gilead is bleak and sort of depressing, but not enough. It doesn't take any emotion far enough to register well, so it just isn't that engaging. What I love about this is that Roy Andersson made an unsuccessful film, and then a great one, But to achieve that transition, he didn't fix what was wrong with the unsuccessful movie. Like, I would say that for what the story is after, Gilead lacks enough human personality or warmth to create attachments between the audience and the characters. Did he learn a lesson and rectify it 20 plus years later? Not at all. The absence of human warmth in Songs from the Second Floor is completely intentional. He made it darker. He turned around the quality of his work, and he did it by elaborating on and developing the more bizarre aspects of what he was doing, instead of addressing in a traditional way the problems that the film had. So after Gilead flopped, he went to making commercials and short films, and that's where his later style really developed. In some sense, it's kind of astounding that this bizarre, unique, dark, satirical filmmaking style came out of television commercials. We must thank whatever was going on in Sweden and whoever was working at all these companies that hired him. A union, the lottery, auto insurance, biscuits. Granted, this isn't really such a surprise. I mean, commercials need to catch the eye and leave a fast impression, and Andersson's work absolutely does that. They're also where his sense of humor developed. These commercials are quick setup punchline. There's one in particular that really feels like a scene from his later films. Let's watch it. Let's just watch a Swedish commercial from the 1980s. What else are we here for? If you were to stretch out these commercials from 1 minute to several and let the joke unfold slowly with a little more strangeness and maybe ambiguity, you would have exactly his later style, down to the pale makeup. There are different theories of why he makes his actors so pale, but one that he mentioned in an interview that I thought was interesting was that it made them more like comic book characters. Like, Charlie Brown is really pale. He's paper. Bill from It's Such a Beautiful Day, he's also paper. The darkness of these dark comedies is absolute. It doesn't get much darker. We're not able to simply laugh at the foibles of modern life and walk away from these films feeling okay. The mechanized horrors of the 20th century haunt his work, and are directly present from the very beginning of his later style. The opening shot of his short film that I mentioned earlier, World of Glory, may for a moment seem like a surreal tableau of cruelty, but it is a horrifyingly real thing that we're seeing here. People being gassed to death by the exhaust of the truck they're being driven around in. This method of killing was one of the first used in the Holocaust. They talk about it in the documentary Shoah. There's a detail in that section which has haunted me to this day. A technical document from the Nazi bureaucracy talking about these execution vans.
La pratique a démontré qu'on pouvait se passer de lampes étant donné que celles-ci ne sont apparemment jamais utilisées. Cependant, on a pu observer qu'au moment de la fermeture des portes, le chargement se presse toujours fortement vers celles-ci, vers les portes, dès que l'obscurité survient. Ceci résulte du fait que le chargement se précipite naturellement vers la lumière lorsque l'obscurité se fait, ce qui rend la fermeture des portes difficile. En outre, on a pu observer qu'à cause du caractère inquiétant de l'obscurité, les cris éclatent toujours au moment de la fermeture des portes.
World of Glory begins with us in the position of a witness to this horror, a face in the crowd, when another face turns and looks directly at us. This turns out to be the narrator of the film, who proceeds to show off his life, his job, his brother, his car. But after what we just saw, how can we look at this? In the end, he hears the screams of the girl being loaded into the truck. His wife encourages him to go to sleep, so he can wake up and go to work tomorrow. In Songs from the Second Floor, we see Belarusian siblings, partisans, being hanged by the Nazis. We also see the characters seeing this. The past is bleeding into the present. The boy follows the main character around, just like his deceased acquaintance does. Andersson's films posit that the Nazi past of Europe was covered up but not remedied. All it takes is one party trick gone wrong to reveal the luxurious wooden table is inscribed with swastikas. The past comes riding in on horseback. What does a ghost look like when the present-day characters look like that? They look just like us. This haunting of the present by the past is also represented in a pigeon sat on a branch reflecting on existence by a surreal and horrifying nightmare of Africans being loaded into a torture device. The device is labeled Boliden, a Swedish mining company that seems bad, according to some extremely cursory research. The torture also produces a kind of music, and so it is entertainment for rich old people. But significantly, this isn't a guilt nightmare of one of those people. It's a dream of the man serving drinks. One of the main characters, and like the protagonist from Songs from the Second Floor, a salesman. In his dream and in his life, this man is powerless, yet he carries the guilt all the same. Can such evil be remedied? If so, how?
Martin Buber han har formulerat det oerhört vackert när han talar om att förbrytelse, brott mot människans ordning eller livets ordning. När man förbryter sig mot det så uppstår så att säga en skuld som gör människan ful och belastad. Människan, menar Buber, han känner detta men kan reparera det. Nödvändigtvis inte på det ställe där förbrytelsen begicks, utan de kan göra det genom att tjäna livet på andra ställen.
Jag tycker det är en otroligt optimistisk formulering. Att det finns en möjlighet att reparera skulden genom att göra gott helt enkelt.
There's a telling moment in a documentary about the making of Songs from the Second Floor regarding this idea of the past flowing into the present. Andersson tells us how the German national anthem today is the same as it was under Hitler, with only a few lyrics changed. He thus plays this anthem underneath the scene of the Nazis hanging the brother and sister. But his collaborator objects to this.
Att identifiera ondska med en sånt. Alltså det man ser att musiken är vacker. Men att det absolut har ingenting att göra med den handling som har skett under andra världskriget. Alltså det är livsfarligt. Alltså det är samma fel som de har gjort. Ingen skillnad. Någon oskyldig till som en symbol för brottet. Alltså det är jättefarligt. Som Deutschland, det går inte.
Det kommer mer, eller?
Now, I don't want to get involved in a European debate. I'm apolitical. When I seek out a newspaper, it's to read the Far Side comic where the two guys are in hell and one of them whispers to the other, "I hate this place." And then into the recycling it goes. The only belief I have that is even kind of political is that the victorious Union Army should have summarily executed the entire leadership of the Confederacy, forbid all officers from holding public office, written a new constitution that abolished the Senate and Electoral College, took away the concessions made to slave states during the nation's founding, and maintained a peacekeeping army presence throughout the South for at least a generation. But other than that one opinion, like I said, I stare out the window a lot. I'm not to be. While these mercilessly dark bits of history continue through all his later films, there is also an arc towards a more complete view of the human being. By the third film, we have scenes that are genuinely sweet. We almost expect him to bring the hammer down, but he doesn't. There's no punchline. There is something beautiful to me about the massive labor of creation that went into creating these scenes in particular. It's as a sympathetic God might look upon us, seeing us in the unit of our smallest measurement, bringing to the fore moments that even we might forget or pass over, might, when recounting our day, omit. There are an uncountable number of such moments in our lives, like dreams we don't remember, or barely remember, or don't deem interesting enough to hold on to. It's rare to see them on film, but Andersson's later work has these warm observational images. Incidentally, Jonas Mekas' magnum opus, As I Was Moving Ahead, Occasionally I Saw Brief Glimpses of Beauty, is 288 minutes of those kinds of moments, and they're the genuine article, footage from his life. In the same spirit, Andersson casts actors and creates characters who are atypical for leading roles, who would ordinarily be omitted or relegated to the background, many of them being non-actors that Andersson or his crew came across in day-to-day life.
Jag sa att min hustru och jag, vi var på Ikea, skulle köpa tyg. Då kom det fram en kille med ett visitkort. Inte en tanke på att åka dit. Utan det var familjen sen som sa det, klart ska åka dit fast. Titta vad det är för någonting. Så blev det ju det.
It's kind of funny to imagine a Hollywood celebrity actor playing the lead role in a Roy Andersson movie. Here should be like footage of George Clooney and Brad Pitt deep faked into the two salesmen from A Pigeon Sat on a Branch Reflecting on Existence. I probably won't figure out how to do that though. It seems hard. So why did he skip the 80s and 90s? So why did he skip the 80s? So why did he skip the 80s and 90s as a feature film director? Roy Andersson had a strong taste of success and failure at a relatively young age in quick succession, and he didn't enjoy either experience. While it was the failure of Gilead that sent him into the cold, as he puts it, it's worth repeating that success was also not something he enjoyed.
Jag var trött på kärlekshistoria. Jag var äcklad nästan över framgången. Jag var äcklad över att höra allt beröm och... Fan, det var ingen kul tid alls efter det där.
Success is a recurring reason why some of these artists skipped the 80s. He seems to have been unsatisfied by both the films he made in the 70s, and perhaps the style he wanted to achieve was so idiosyncratic that he had to go into the laboratory of short film and commercial production to uncover it. Maybe it was a style that couldn't work in half measures. It had to be embraced and developed completely. Andersson spent the 80s building a commercial studio, doing work for others, while at the same time assembling a team and infrastructure which he could then leverage into absolute creative freedom for himself. This might remind you of another person who skipped the 1980s as a feature film director and spent it building a commercial studio with which to leverage into absolute creative freedom for himself. And they both directed 6 feature films. This other person and Roy Andersson even both had the pleasure, presumably she seems cool, of directing actress Pernilla August. We can elude him no longer. We must speak of George Lucas.